So from today we are going to start a series on the Spring Boot annotations, and this series is going to be very interesting because uh, if you are preparing for any interview, either you are a fresher or experienced, if you are giving an interview, so at least 2 to 3 questions you can expect in your interview. So that's why I thought we should have a series where all the Spring Boot annotations which we are using mostly in our Spring Boot application, those we should cover, and we are going to cover all those annotation in very deep, so that you should understand how those annotation is working, what are the different variation that we can use those annotations, and what are the different questions that an interviewer can ask on those annotations. And also one thing I found that on the YouTube there is no specific video or a series which is going or explaining all the annotations. So that's why I thought of creating a series on the Spring Boot annotations. And today this is the first video of this series where we are going to cover the most important annotations of the Spring Boot, which is Autowired annotations. So in this video, what we are going to cover is the Autowired, like what is the basics of the Autowired annotations, a basic theory, and the code example for that. And then we are going to discuss what are the different type of dependency injection, or what are the different variation where we can use the Autowired annotation. Then we will understand some scenario based interview questions, scenarios where we can how that Autowired annotation will work. Those we will see in the scenario based interview questions, and this is the most interesting thing, because in the interviewer will not ask direct questions on the Autowired annotation. He will ask the scenario based questions. So this part is very important if you are preparing for an interview. Then we will go and discuss how Autowired annotation works internally. So this part is for the senior developers, but if you want to know how Autowired annotation is working, even for a fresher, they can check this part as well. Then at the last, I'm going to say like it's a bonus resource where you can find these different interview questions or different scenario based questions. Like we are going to cover some scenario based questions, but I will not be able to cover all the questions. So I have attached all most of the ask scenario based questions in the bonus resource sheet. So if you want this bonus resource sheet, make sure that you are watching this video till the end. So let's start with the Autowired annotation. So the first very basic theory about the Autowired annotation is like this is the most important annotation in a Spring Boot application. So if you are checking any Spring Boot application, the one thing you will notice is the Autowired annotation. And why this is important? Because the entire Spring Boot is having the main feature is the dependency injection, and this annotation is serving that feature. So when you want to inject a dependency in a class, then we use Autowired annotation. So the purpose of this Autowired annotation is used to automatically inject dependencies, and it can be applied on the constructor, field, and methods. So the very basic or very high level of idea of the Autowired annotation is whenever we want to inject a dependencies, then we use Autowired annotation. Now let's see a code example and how we can use the Autowired annotation. So here I have created some few classes here. So the one first class is the book controller class, where I have a very simple API which is returning some list of books, and then I have a interface iBook service where a simple method I have, and that implementation of this method is there in the book service, which is implementing the iBook service class, iBook service interface. Now in the controller, the thing to notice here is I have a field iBook service, and I want to inject, because I want to inject a dependency of this book service class. This book service class which is the implementation of iBook service. I want to inject that dependency in this class. Now, uh, now we know that the Autowired annotation we can use to inject a dependency, but there are different ways through which we can inject dependencies. So if you have a very basic knowledge about the different type of injection, so there are different injection like constructor based injection, field based injection, or a setter level injection. So now the first let's see the field level injection. So here I can use a Autowired annotation on the top of your field. So what it will do, it will inject the bean of iBook service interface into this particular field, and this field we are using to get all the books. Now let's run this application and see whether this API is working or not. So in this API, in this get all books method, we are returning just a list of two elements. So our API should return this two element. So here our service started successfully. Now I'm not using Postman here to call this API. I'm using a curl. So now I'm using curl here. So this is an API I called here. This is the localhost 8080 and slash API and slash, which is the path of our API. And you can see the status code is 200 and this API is returning the list of two books which we are returning from this. So that means this Autowired annotation is working here as a field level injection. Now we will use a different annotation, different variation of the dependency injection, which is constructor based injection. So for that, what I will do, I will create a constructor here. Now I will remove this Autowired annotation here from this field. I will use the iBook service here and then book service field here. Now here in this we can call this iBook service and then we can assign the value. Here on this particular constructor we can use the Autowired. So this is an example of constructor based dependency injection which we are using through the Autowired. Now I will just restart this service and see whether this API is working now or not. Because the main idea of starting the service to know that whether this bean is injected properly or not, and we are able to call the API. So our service started. Now I'm going to call that API again. Now you can see that we are returning 200 status code and the API is also returning the response of with the two books. So this constructor based injection is also working here. Now let's discuss the third type of dependency injection is a setter based injection. So for that we have to create a setter method. So this is a field and in the IntelliJ, if you select this field and go right click on this and you can click on generate and you will find out a different things here. So we want to generate a setter method here. So click on this field, select your particular field and click OK and your setter method will be created. Now I will just remove this constructor here. Here on this, what we have to do, we have to assign, we have to mark this particular setter method with the Autowired annotation. So this is an example of your setter based injection. We will just restart this service and see whether this API is working or not. We are able to, Spring is able to assign a bean of this iBook service or not. So our service started successfully. Now let's call this API. Okay, we are able to receive the response. So this API is working here. So our setter based injection is working properly. So this is how the Autowired annotation works. We can use the Autowired annotation with different variation. One is the field based injection, second is the constructor based injection, third is your setter method injection. Let's understand some scenarios which can be asked in their interviews. So interview can ask some scenario based questions on this. So let's first go back to your the field based injection here. Okay, now the first question can be asked is, so here we have used a field based injection and we mark this field as a public. So the first question can be asked, what will happen if we mark this field as a private? Will this Autowired annotation will work or not? Will a Spring will be able to inject a dependency of this interface or not? So let's restart the service and see whether this after marking this field as a private, will this our API is working or not. So our Spring started successfully. Now let's call an API. So you can see we are able to get the response. That means if we mark the field as a private and we are using the field based injection, still Spring is able to inject the bean in your particular field. So that is the first scenario based question. Second scenario based question can be asked like if you are using a constructor based injection. So I will just create a constructor here. Okay, now I have marked this as an autowire. Now the second question can be asked is like you are using a constructor based injection here, and this constructor is now marked as a default. But what will happen if we mark this constructor as a private? Will this now will the Autowired annotation will work or not? So let's restart the service and see whether our API is working or not. So our service started successfully. Let's call the API again. Now you can see we are able to get the response. That means even if you mark a constructor as a private, your API, your Spring is able to inject the bean. So that is the second scenario based question. Now the one variation can also be asked is uh, if that the class that we are injecting, if that class doesn't have if that class constructor is private, what will happen? So here if we suppose we mark the constructor as private, so book service, and this constructor we have marked as a, this is a default constructor without any argument, and we have marked this constructor as a private. Now will this API will work? Yes, this API will work. So even if you mark the one that you are injecting, even that have a private constructor, even that also, like even in that case as well, your Spring will able to inject the bean, and your Automated annotation will work here. So that is the other variation of the same question. Now the one thing to notice here is when we see a simple Java application, because Spring Boot internally is a Java application. So when we see a simple Java application, so let's suppose you have a private constructor, and like in this case we have a private constructor and we have marked this Autowired. So how, like this private, if you are marking this constructor as a private, then you will not be able to create a bean of this class outside, because this constructor is private. So then how Spring is able to inject a bean here? In a simple Java application, if you want to assign a value to a particular field, let's suppose this is the field, and you want to assign a value to this field, what are the different ways? First way, if it is a field is public, you can directly access the field and you can assign a value using the dot operator. If it is a private, then you should have a setter method to set this particular field. Third thing, either if your constructor allowed to pass that particular parameter, then also while creating an object, you can pass the value of this. But in now in this case, in our class, that like none of the three thing is present. We don't have any setter method, even our field is private, and even our constructor is private. And here the most important feature comes into picture of Java in the Autowired is reflection API. So Autowired internally use reflection API to injecting a bean. So when you go for a reflection, then either if your constructor is a private or your field is a private, no matter. Spring the reflection is able to access the field of a class. And because of that, even in case when we are using Autowired, even your constructor is private, your field is private, or it doesn't have a setter method, Spring is able to inject a bean. So when someone asks ki how, if this scenario based question is asked in an interview, then you should be able to explain that the Autowired annotation internally use Java Reflection API, and because of that, our constructor, or like there is a no, if there is a no visibility of your constructor, your field, there is a no setter method. Even that case as well, we are the Spring is able to inject a bean. That is the most asked scenario based question if you go for a senior level interview. Okay, now one more interview question can be asked as a scenario based question is let's suppose the class that you are injecting here and which is not available at the runtime. So how would you mark that this dependency as a optional? So because when you are marking as an Autowired annotation, then Spring will make sure that the class that you are injecting, that bean should be there. If the bean is not present in the container, then Spring will throw an error. So how we can mark this particular class as optional so that the Autowired annotation will not throw an error. So for that, what we can do, we can use a value here where If you see here, the one field we can use is required. So we can use required and false. So what will happen now, that even if your dependency, the one that you are injecting, if it is the bean is not present in the container, then Spring will not throw an error. That is called the optional dependency injection. Now I'm going to explain you how the Autowired annotation works internally. What are the different steps that comes into picture when we are injecting a bean using the Autowired annotation. So here I have created a document where I have mentioned all the steps one by one and what that step is actually doing. All I have mentioned here. So this sheet link I will share with you. So let's see how this Autowired annotation works with all the steps that comes into picture while injecting a bean. So the first thing comes into picture is the bean creation and the registration. So when our Spring application start, the first thing that creates is the container, and the container is the place where all the beans which Spring initialize, those all are stored in the container. So and for that particular, if you want to access that container, then we can use the application context class. So when the Spring application starts, the first thing that creates is the application context, and which is the container responsible for managing the beans. Now what it will do, that like, how it will register those beans and it will store in the container, that comes into picture the class path. So Spring automatically check the class path, or if you have a mention using the component scan annotation, and based on that path it will find out all the beans that Spring has to register and initialize into the container. Now the second step is like dependency resolution. So you have marked the Autowired annotation in like multiple places in your classes or in multiple places in your application. So that Autowired annotation gives us signals that this particular constructor based injection or field based injection or setter based injection required an injection of a particular bean. So Spring will internally use a reflection to find out like where it actually has to inject a bean. So that comes the second step, where basically we have identified in the class where the Autowired annotation is used and which type of annotation, which type of injection we have to use. So that is the second step. Then after, the third step is like actually finding out the type of injection we are going. It's a constructor based injection, a setter based injection, or a field based injection. Now after that, like we have used the, let's suppose we have used the field based injection. So in our example, if you see here, this is a field based injection. So after identify that we have to do a field based injection, it find out like what type of bean it has to inject. Because let's suppose now it's an interface and which can have multiple implementation of this interface. In Spring by default, the Autowired annotation works by type. Spring resolve the dependency by type as a by default, and so it will, what it will do, it will check that where the Autowired field is used, Spring searches that particular bean in your application context. And if multiple beans of the same type are found, then Spring will throw a no unique bean definition exception. Or there are multiple ways through which we can resolve this, but the most important thing to notice here is that based on the type, the particular injection will be happen. Now there is like a step, if there are multiple beans for a particular type, let's suppose an interface have multiple beans, so in that case how to handle those, so those step come into picture. Those we are going to like how to handle this scenario, like what is the qualifier annotation, what is the primary annotation, those we'll see in the next video. But here the step come where we have to handle the multiple beans. Now the one thing that we discuss here, the sixth step is the optional dependencies. After the sixth step, the seventh step comes where the circular dependency resolution happens. So there could be a scenario where your one class is dependent on another and both class have the dependency of each other. So in that case, Spring do some automatic ways to handle this. So also depends on the type of injection that you're doing, whether you are doing a constructor based injection or a field based injection or setter based injection. So sometimes Spring automatically try to resolve this issue, but sometimes if it is not able to do, then what we do, like in manually we use the lazy annotations over there, that we will discuss later. So this is the one steps come where the circular dependency comes into picture, then this particular steps come into picture. Now after this steps, where is the post processing happens. So, like the actual injection of the dependency happens during the post-processing phase, and this in this phase only we are actually injecting the bean. And then there are some scenarios like we are using AOP where we are using the proxy of the object, not the actual object. So that proxy of that object will be injected instead of the actual bean. So there are scenarios where when we are working with the AOP, that then this particular step will come into picture. And then after there are like once your bean is injected into that particular field, then there are different ways where you can use the post construct basically the post construct annotation, where like after the initialization if you want to do something else then you can do this. So that life cycle hooks also provided. So these are the 10 steps where come into picture when the actual Autowired, like in the internal working of the Autowired. So how Autowired basically doing the dependency injection, then this all 10 step comes into picture. So if you are preparing for a senior developer position, then this 10 step you should be aware how the Autowired annotation internally working. Now, if you have reached till this video, then there is a bonus thing that I'm going to share. Like in this sheet here, I have also attached some most asked interview questions with the answers. You can go and check out. And also I have attached the scenario based questions, which is very important because like nowadays most of the interview will not ask you a direct question. They will give you a scenario and they'll ask what will happen or what will you do, how to resolve this particular scenario, or what how to resolve this issue. Then the scenario based question is very important for an interview perspective. So I have added 10 scenario based questions which cover most of the questions around the Autoword annotation. So the few of the scenario based questions we have already covered, we have seen the code as well, but there are some scenarios based questions which I have included here. So few, if we go from the like if we go very high level, so the scenario one is like multiple beans of the same type. So an interface have multiple beans, then there are some notation which we use to solve this. So this is one of question, it's very most asked questions in the scenario based questions. Then second is like optional dependency injection that we have already covered. Then the circular dependency, how Spring manage the circular dependency, or what are the manual ways to handle the circular dependency. Then when you should go for the constructor injection, when you should go for the field injection, or what is the best way for injecting a bean. Like we have three different variation of the dependency injection. Which one is the better? Then there is like if you want to inject a list of beans, so let's suppose your interface have multiple implementation and you want to store all those beans in all those beans you want to inject. Then how to do that? Then there are list of classes, so how that list of beans can be injected. Then how to inject a bean by name, because the Spring internally is use a by type for the Autoware dependency injection, but then how you can use a by name. Then also what are the notation we use, those you can see in this. Then changing dependency at runtime, like here you can see the payment service have a dev payment service and the prod. So this implementation should come into picture when the profile is prod, when the profile is dev. So how to change the dependency at the runtime, then this is this is also an interesting question. Then there are some scenarios that we already tested, like if the auto had been with the no public constructor or the private field. So there are the 10 scenarios, 10 scenario based questions I have covered, and this sheet link I will attach in the video description. You can go and check out. If you like this video, do share with your friends, and in the comment you can mention like if anything, any part of this video you have not understood, you can mention in the comment. I will answer your query as soon as possible.